A big thanks goes out to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. Well, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining me for this week's video. I really appreciate it as always. Today I want to talk about framing within the frame. It's one of those compositional techniques that you hear about all the time, but often see done in ways that perhaps feel a bit forced. A big tree arching over the top of the frame, a doorway with the subject perfectly centered inside. And now don't get me wrong, it can work and I use this technique all the time, but it's not the only way. So today I want to talk about how to use framing more subtly in ways that guide the eye and add depth without the viewer even noticing that you've done it. So let's get stuck right in. Now at its heart, framing is about control. It's about guiding your viewer's gaze exactly where you want it and creating a sense of being invited into the scene. And done well, it's almost invisible. The viewer feels drawn in without thinking, oh, that's a frame. Framing can also add depth. By including an element close to the camera, you create layers, and with layers comes a stronger sense of three-dimensional space in a two-dimensional image. This first example is an older image of mine, and it was an obvious choice for this presentation. And the reason being, it's basically a frame within a frame within a frame. And that frame doesn't really frame any particular subject other than a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. Now, if you look at the raw file, I did some pretty heavy-handed dodging and burning, and for good reason. I really wanted to darken those edges to get rid of any distractions. But all your attention goes to the center of the frame. Now, even though this looks like an obvious subject, it's not that obvious to photograph. You really have to find it. It's a low perspective, so you're basically on your hands and knees when you photograph this. And the branches don't form a perfect circle. You have to more or less move your camera to left or right, up and down, to get the perfect shot that frames all these different frames within each other. But it is a good example of what I'm talking about, and as we progress throughout this presentation, I'll try to portray some more subtle examples. Now, of course, buildings make excellent subjects when it comes to framing other subjects, and this is no exception. What I really like about this image is not only does it frame another window, but the landscape beyond mimics the triangular shapes in the upper right corner and the midsection there. I also decided to process this image really bright, and because it was very desolate and isolated. The building was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by desert, very hot and sunny. So I thought the bleached out look really fit well with the subject matter. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Now, don't get me wrong, obvious framing has its place and I use it all the time. You might have something like an archway in a ruin, a window looking out over a valley, but it can quickly feel like a gimmick if it's too staged. Subtle framing, on the other hand, is where things get interesting. Instead of a perfect outline around your subject, you might have a shadow that pushes the eye inward, a soft blur from out of focus leaves, or a darker ridge of rock that creates a natural top edge. The viewer doesn't think, oh, there's a frame, they just focus where you want them to. This example of framing is a little bit less obvious than the previous examples. What initially attracted me to this scene were the backlit mossy branches in the central portion there. And the framing is actually the two trees framing that section. But the outer edges also add to that framing. But I had to do a bit of Photoshop work to try and help maintain the interest in the central portion. So what I've done here, I've actually darkened the outside edges considerably, but I've also cooled them down. You'll notice that the outer edge is quite a bit cooler than the central portion, but it is framed by those two trees and then the other chaotic branches on the outside. So not quite as obvious, but there is some framing going on here. Now, frames can be created by almost anything. You have natural elements such as trees, rocks, overhanging cliffs, snowbanks. You also have light and shadow. You might have patches of light framed by darker areas. There's also weather. Fog creates a softer border around your subject. And then there's man-made structures like fences, bridges, windows. And you also have reflections, water framing the brighter subject within. The important thing is to keep them from overpowering the scene. Your frame should feel like it supports the subject and not compete with it. This photograph here is one of my favorites from Carmanah Provincial Park on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And I have to thank Brian Barnum for this, because Brian was the one that showed me this grove of trees, and it worked out to be a beautiful little area to photograph. What I really like about this photograph is the light, and that's what really attracted me to this scene, was that branch in the upper kind of left side there in the midsection. I really wanted to frame that with something, and the spruce on the outside on the left and right really did a great job of adding a frame. If those had been sunlit, then I probably would have had to really darken them, but as it is, they're in shadow, and the light was soft enough that it still illuminated the branches really well, but also gave you details in the shadow. So it was kind of an overcast, bright, sunny day, and it worked out perfect for this example. To the casual viewer, this image looks very chaotic, and it is very chaotic, but it was done on purpose. In British Columbia, most of the forests tend to be conifers, and for those of you that have photographed a lot of conifers, you know that they aren't necessarily the most interesting trees. They tend to be very straight. Even the big trees, even though they might be big at the base, they're very tall, but they pretty much just go straight up and down. There's not an awful lot of character. So what I try to do is I'll look for some kind of framing so that I'm not just photographing a tree in a forest. So in this case, what I've tried to do is frame the shrub in such a way that even though the conifer is the main subject, it looks like it's a secondary subject because it's shrouded in this veil of this shrub with these backlit leaves. And I'll often do this when I go into a forest. I'll look for something to frame that main subject, especially conifers. So something to keep in mind. Thank you once again to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. Are you ready to take your online presence to the next level? Meet Design Intelligence by Squarespace, a fusion of world-class design and AI technology that unlocks your creative potential like never before. Build a stunning, personalized website that's as unique as you are and stands out from the crowd. With Squarespace Payments, managing transactions is easier than ever. Get started in just a few clicks and let your customers pay their way, whether it's Apple Pay, Afterpay, or more. Need to invoice clients? Squarespace has you covered. Simplify your workflow and focus on growing your business. If you're interested in building an awesome website, why not head on over to squarespace.com and give it a try. And if you like what you find, use the code AdamGibbs for 10% off your first purchase. Where you place the frame in your composition changes the feel. If the frame is too tight, it can feel cramped. Too loose, and it might not read as intentional. Think about how the shape of your frame element works with the actual aspect ratio that you've chosen. And balance matters as well. If your frame is too heavy on one side, you might need another element to offset it elsewhere in the composition. This is a photograph that I made several years ago in Scotland on a trip with my good friend Paul Thompson. And I remember when I took this, it took me quite some time to figure out a composition. My idea was to try and photograph the Scots pine with the mountains in the background. The tree that I really liked was the one that's just off center there, the little one just to the right. And I spent quite some time trying to scrutinize and frame it. It would have been very easy to just photograph just that tree with perhaps the two trunks on each side. But I wanted to include more. And often more is not better, but in this case it worked out quite well. The other thing that I think this photograph does have is good balance. That little tree that's framed by the central tree and the one on the right is balanced by the other Scots pine, which is on the left side. And the mountains come in, they're more of a backdrop. The hardest part was just waiting for some half decent light, which is always a challenge in Scotland. But framing doesn't have to be just a frame with the subject in the middle. A lot of the times I'll have my framed subject or the thing that attracted me to the scene as a small part of that scene. So it doesn't have to fill up the whole frame, it can just be a very small part of the frame. Next time you're out shooting, try looking for frames first. Don't just find your subject and then look for a frame. Move around, get low, change your height. Use your lens choice to compress or exaggerate the frame. And sometimes the best frames are accidental. You spot them only when you change your position slightly. And don't be afraid to let the frame blur out if it's close to the lens. That softness can be much more inviting than perhaps a sharper edge. A well-placed frame works beautifully with other compositional decisions, like aspect ratio, visual weight, or flow. Think of the frame as part of the overall structure, not a separate trick. It should feel like it belongs naturally to the scene. In these next three examples, I've more or less used the same techniques. Not only have I found something to frame the waterfalls with, but I've also tried to include a foreground element to add depth. Now this first photograph here, I've framed the waterfall with this western red cedar and this red alder that's on the left side leaning out of the frame. The one thing that I did have to be careful of was that I didn't include a lot of white in the stream leading out to the left, because that would tend to lead the viewer's eye out of the frame. So something that you have to be really careful of is checking the outside of your frame so you're not having any elements that you use for your framing draw your viewer's attention. In the last photograph here, something that I should mention is that the branches in the foreground seem like they're very large, but they're actually quite small. What I've done here is I've got really close with a very wide lens, and because of that, these branches look much bigger than they are. So something you can try is you don't always have to have a large foreground. You can get up really close with a wide angle lens to a rather small subject and make it look large in the frame. It's somewhat deceiving, but it works really well when you can find something that will draw your viewer's attention into the frame. Alright guys, thank you ever so much for joining me on this week's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, thumbs up is always appreciated. Before I leave you, I just want to mention my newsletter. If you'd like to go over to my website at adamgibbs.com and sign up for my newsletter, I am giving away prints monthly to subscribers. The catch is though, you actually have to read the newsletter to find out who the winners are. I won't be announcing the winners on any other social media platforms, so you're on the hook. All right, guys, thank you ever so much. I really appreciate it. And until next time, bye-bye.